On January 20, 2025, President Donald Trump, upon beginning his second term, issued an executive order establishing the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, designed to be the centerpiece of his administration's aggressive cost-cutting strategy. DOGE was tasked with modernizing federal operations, eliminating bureaucratic inefficiencies, and drastically reducing government spending. Unlike a traditional federal agency, DOGE was never approved by Congress. Instead, the administration co-opted the existing United States Digital Service, a relatively small but influential agency originally created during the Obama administration to modernize government technology. By repurposing USDS and renaming it the United States DOGE Service, the White House circumvented the need for legislative approval while granting DOGE sweeping authority over federal data systems and workforce restructuring. The executive order establishing DOGE placed it under the Office of Management and Budget, which gave it influence over government-wide financial and administrative policies. However, its real power came from its unrestricted access to federal data infrastructure. DOGE positioned itself as an AI-driven decision-making body, using machine learning and advanced analytics to identify redundancies, streamline processes, and determine cost-saving opportunities. This technology-driven approach was championed by Elon Musk, who has acted as DOGE's de facto director despite no official appointment, and his ongoing leadership roles at Tesla and SpaceX. Musk's involvement was framed as an effort to bring private sector efficiency into government operations, with the administration promising that DOGE would apply Silicon Valley-style innovation to the federal bureaucracy. The structural integration of DOGE into the federal government was unconventional and, to some, legally dubious. USDS had been a relatively obscure but crucial agency, composed of engineers, product managers and designers who worked across federal departments to improve government IT systems. Under DOGE, the USDS workforce was repurposed to serve an entirely different mission, one that focused less on improving government services and more on dismantling what the administration considered unnecessary bureaucratic functions. Many former USDS employees found themselves reassigned to data analysis teams tasked with recommending agency-wide layoffs. Others were ordered to develop automation tools that would replace federal workers in administrative roles. The scope of DOGE's authority rapidly expanded, leading to mass personnel reviews across nearly every major government department. Unlike previous workforce reductions, which followed a formalized process through the Office of Personnel Management, DOGE operated under direct executive authority, making it possible to bypass traditional protections for federal employees. Probationary employees, those with less than 1 year of service, became particularly vulnerable as they lacked the legal protections granted to more senior civil servants. DOGE's operational methodology was built on a data-driven approach to workforce reduction. By consolidating HR records, financial data and workflow metrics from federal agencies, DOGE's AI-driven systems generated reports that identified employees deemed non-essential. These assessments, however, were far from perfect. Critics pointed out that DOGE's algorithms frequently misclassified essential personnel as redundant, leading to major disruptions in government operations. For example, the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, mistakenly terminated key cybersecurity personnel, only to reverse the decision days later after realizing the critical risks it posed to national security. A defining feature of DOGE was its heavy reliance on artificial intelligence. Unlike previous federal workforce restructuring efforts, which were largely handled by human-led review processes, DOGE introduced automated systems capable of analyzing vast amounts of employment and operational data at an unprecedented scale. These AI models were designed to predict long-term efficiency outcomes based on historical performance metrics, often reducing complex human roles to algorithmic determinations. One of DOGE's most controversial initiatives was the AI-driven Government Restructuring Program, which sought to replace clerical and administrative staff with machine learning systems. This effort led to abrupt layoffs across multiple departments, particularly within the IRS, Department of Veterans Affairs, and Department of Agriculture. Employees in these agencies reported that their terminations were processed without prior notice, often based on algorithmic determinations that did not account for the nuances of individual job functions. In many cases, workers received emails informing them of their dismissal with no opportunity for appeal. To support this rapid overhaul, DOGE implemented a 24/7 work culture for its internal staff, many of whom were recruited from the tech industry. Reports surfaced that DOGE employees were working 120-hour weeks, sleeping in AI-powered pods within the Office of Personnel Management and operating under intense pressure to deliver cost-cutting results. The high-stakes environment led to numerous errors in layoff decisions and misreporting of projected savings, raising concerns that DOGE's rapid execution was outpacing its ability to ensure accuracy and fairness. The internal pressure at DOGE ultimately led to a mass resignation of key personnel. On February 25, 2025, 21 senior engineers, data scientists, and policy experts resigned in protest, publicly stating that they refused to participate in the dismantling of critical public services. Their resignation letter, addressed to White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, criticized DOGE for prioritizing political expediency over responsible governance. The letter alleged that DOGE's restructuring efforts had severely compromised cybersecurity protections, weakened federal disaster response capabilities, and gutted social service programs without adequate replacements. Beyond ethical concerns, many DOGE employees also feared serious security risks. By consolidating vast amounts of government data under a single AI-driven system, DOGE inadvertently created a highly vulnerable central point of failure. Former employees warned that if hackers or foreign adversaries gained access to DOGE's data infrastructure, they could potentially manipulate or erase critical federal records, leading to widespread chaos. These concerns, however, were dismissed by DOGE leadership, who insisted that AI-powered security measures were sufficient to protect against cyber threats. It now has been just over a month since the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, began its sweeping overhaul of the federal government, and already cracks are forming in the systems that sustain the country. Layoffs in key agencies have introduced dysfunction that, for now, remains mostly contained. But if these cuts continue, and if the government does not act swiftly to reverse them, the damage will soon spiral beyond control. The logic of governance is not transactional, but systemic. Every agency does not simply perform its own function in isolation. Each relies on others to operate effectively. The federal government is a web of interdependent systems, and when one thread is pulled, the entire structure begins to unravel. What we are seeing today are only the first signs of strain. If these trends persist, they will reinforce and amplify one another, leading to a full-scale breakdown of public services, economic stability, and national security. To understand the full scale of the damage, we will explore the breakdown of essential government functions in three escalating phases. First, the crippling of financial, logistical and research infrastructure at the IRS, GSA and NSF. Second, the failure of disease control and food security in the face of a bird flu outbreak at the CDC, NIH and USDA. And third, the weakening of U.S. foreign operations and national security at USAID, DOD and the CIA. Each section illustrates how DOGE's policies undermined public services, scientific progress and national security, leading to long-term consequences that the government is still struggling to contain. The federal government's ability to function depends on three critical pillars: revenue collection, logistical operations, and technological research. The Internal Revenue Service, IRS, General Services Administration, GSA, and National Science Foundation, NSF, each play a vital role in ensuring that agencies are funded, supplied, and equipped with cutting-edge solutions. However, DOGE's sweeping layoffs have simultaneously weakened all three, setting off a chain reaction that will, in the coming months, leave entire government operations paralyzed. If these cuts are not reversed, the US government will soon face budget shortfalls that will deepen over time, an inability to maintain even basic operational infrastructure, and a scientific community starved of the research funding necessary to keep the nation competitive. These failures will reinforce each other, leaving a government that is increasingly incapable of responding to emerging crises, whether financial, technological, or logistical. DOGE's mass layoffs of 6,000–7,000 IRS employees, including auditors, fraud investigators and customer service representatives, have already begun to slow tax return processing, but this is only the beginning of the crisis. As peak tax season approaches, the IRS backlog will grow exponentially, delaying refunds for millions of Americans. The direct effect of this will be a sharp contraction in consumer spending, which will ripple through the economy, weakening businesses and slowing GDP growth. More dangerously, fraud detection and enforcement operations have been gutted. With so few investigators left, tax evasion will surge, resulting in billions in lost revenue, far outweighing any savings DOGE hoped to achieve. These revenue losses will directly impact every federal agency, as budgetary shortfalls force further cutbacks. As the IRS loses its ability to collect funds, the entire federal government will struggle to operate. The General Services Administration, GSA, plays an unglamorous but indispensable role in ensuring that federal agencies function properly. Over 100 probationary employees have already been dismissed, most of them responsible for procurement, facility maintenance and contract oversight. At first, these cuts will cause minor inconveniences, longer wait times for office supplies, postponed building maintenance. But within months, the failure to process federal contracts efficiently will leave agencies without critical IT infrastructure, failing heating and electrical systems, and an inability to secure the equipment necessary to conduct normal operations. The dysfunction will not be limited to office logistics. As maintenance backlogs grow, federal buildings will begin to physically deteriorate, making basic government operations impossible in some locations. More critically, the agencies responsible for national security and public health depend on GSA procurement to maintain their operations. If GSA becomes too dysfunctional to support them, agencies like the CDC, USDA, and DOD will see their crises compounded by sheer logistical failure. The National Science Foundation, NSF, which funds technological research and innovation, has been slashed by 10%, with 168 employees abruptly fired. This includes research grant administrators, the people responsible for ensuring that scientists across the country receive funding for critical projects. In the short term, these cuts mean that many labs will see delays or reductions in their federal grants. But by mid-2025, entire projects will begin shutting down. Climate science, artificial intelligence research and medical innovation will all suffer as researchers move to the private sector or foreign institutions. The damage to the NSF will directly weaken the IRS and GSA, both of which rely on NSF-funded innovations. The IRS depends on AI-driven fraud detection models, many of which are funded through NSF-backed research. As NSF loses funding, fraud prevention will worsen and IRS revenue losses will deepen. Similarly, the GSA depends on advancements in procurement technology and cybersecurity research, both of which will be hamstrung by funding cuts. The failure of any one of these agencies would be damaging, but together they will cripple the government's ability to function. The IRS will be unable to collect the revenue necessary to fund the government. The GSA will be unable to provide the infrastructure necessary for agencies to function. The NSF will be unable to supply the innovation necessary to keep government systems competitive in a rapidly advancing world. This is the first stage of systemic collapse, a government that can no longer sustain itself. If this continues, the next crisis, whether economic, public health-related or military, will be met with nothing but dysfunction and failure. Public health and food security are deeply interwoven, with federal agencies working in tight coordination to prevent biological threats from escalating into full-blown crises. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the US Department of Agriculture, USDA. Each play a vital role in protecting the nation from infectious disease outbreaks, but none of them can do it alone. The CDC tracks outbreaks and coordinates containment. The NIH develops treatments and vaccines, and the USDA ensures agricultural disease control and food safety. If one of these agencies fails in its mission, the others come under enormous strain, and if all three are weakened simultaneously, the system will collapse outright. That is exactly what is about to happen. As a new strain of avian influenza, H5N2, spreads through US poultry farms, the agencies responsible for containing it are already crippled by DOGE's layoffs and budget cuts. If this outbreak worsens, it will not be due to bad luck or an unavoidable crisis. It will be because DOGE systematically dismantled the infrastructure designed to prevent it. The CDC has already laid off 1,300 employees, many of them epidemiologists and field investigators, the very people responsible for tracking, studying, and containing infectious diseases. In past outbreaks, CDC teams would be deployed to affected areas within days, working with state health officials and agricultural authorities to coordinate containment before an outbreak could spread. Now, those response teams simply do not exist in sufficient numbers. Case data is already coming in too slowly. Testing capacity is falling behind, and without adequate tracking, the CDC will not be able to determine where and how quickly the virus is spreading. For now, H5N2 is limited to poultry, but if it mutates and jumps to humans, a very real possibility, the CDC will be too overwhelmed to respond effectively. What should have been a controlled agricultural outbreak could become a full-scale public health crisis, simply because there were not enough epidemiologists left to contain it in time. Even if H5N2 does not mutate into a human transmissible virus, its economic and public health impact will be severe. The best way to minimize this damage is through proactive vaccine development, something that until recently the National Institutes of Health, NIH, was well equipped to fund and coordinate. That is no longer the case. NIH's vaccine research programs have already been undermined by funding cuts that have delayed and in some cases completely halted research on avian influenza vaccines. Normally, the NIH partners with pharmaceutical companies to ensure that vaccines are developed and manufactured at scale before an outbreak worsens. But without those partnerships in place, there is no active federal effort to develop an H5N2 vaccine. The consequences of this failure will not be felt immediately, but by the time they are, it will be too late to reverse them. If human infections begin appearing, the NIH will not have a vaccine ready to deploy, and the country will be forced into a reactive crisis mode instead of a proactive containment strategy. While the CDC and NIH focus on human health, the USDA is responsible for agricultural disease control, ensuring that outbreaks like H5N2 do not spiral into full-scale food crises. But USDA's ability to manage this outbreak has already been compromised. Layoffs have hit food safety inspectors and agricultural monitoring teams, slowing the USDA's ability to track the spread of infections across farms. If containment orders do not arrive in time, poultry producers will be left to make their own decisions about culling livestock. Some may act too slowly, allowing infections to spread further. Others may panic and overcull, creating unnecessary supply shortages. The result will be chaos in the poultry market, and once the public begins seeing higher prices and supply shortages, it will already be too late to stabilize the system. If any one of these agencies were fully operational, it might be able to compensate for the failures of another. But with all three of them compromised, the outbreak will escalate unchecked. Without the CDC tracking the outbreak properly, the USDA will not be able to issue effective containment measures, allowing H5N2 to spread beyond control. Without the USDA containing the outbreak, the CDC will be overwhelmed by an expanding crisis it is no longer staffed to handle. Without the NIH funding vaccine research, the country will have no pharmaceutical response ready if the virus jumps to humans. The moment poultry prices spike at grocery stores, the public will feel the impact of this failure firsthand. But the worst consequences may still be ahead. If H5N2 crosses into humans, and there is no surveillance infrastructure to track it, no containment system to stop it, and no vaccine to protect people from it, then we will be facing the beginning of a crisis that could have been prevented. This is not just about H5N2. There will always be new infectious diseases, and the country's ability to prevent pandemics has historically depended on the combined efforts of the CDC, NIH, and USDA. But that system is on the verge of collapse, and if it is not repaired immediately, the next outbreak, whether it is H5N2, a new strain of COVID, or something even worse, will meet a government that no longer has the capacity to fight it. A public health crisis is coming. The only question is whether we allow it to become a catastrophe. The United States maintains its global influence through a combination of humanitarian aid, military readiness, and intelligence operations. Each of these functions relies on close coordination between agencies that work to stabilize regions, deter adversaries, and track emerging threats before they become crises. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the Department of Defense, DOD, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, form the backbone of American global strategy. USAID ensures economic and humanitarian stability, preventing the kinds of conditions that lead to conflict. The DOD provides military deterrence and rapid response capabilities to protect U.S. interests. The CIA gathers critical intelligence to anticipate global threats and guide military and diplomatic decisions, but DOGE's sweeping cuts have simultaneously crippled all three agencies, unraveling the infrastructure that sustains U.S. global leadership, military readiness, and national security. If these cuts are not reversed, America will cede power and influence to rival nations, while becoming increasingly blind and vulnerable to external threats. USAID has been devastated by DOGE's actions, with over 10,000 employees placed on administrative leave, effectively gutting the agency overnight. With its workforce slashed to just 300 people, USAID's ability to distribute foreign aid, fund development projects, and coordinate disaster relief has been reduced to almost nothing. At first, this will be seen as an absence rather than a crisis. Aid shipments will slow, infrastructure projects will stall, and partner organizations will struggle to continue operations. But within months, the world will adjust. China and Russia will seize the opportunity to replace American influence with their own, offering loans, investments, and aid programs to nations that once relied on the US. By mid-2025, we will begin to see the irreversible effects of this shift. Governments in Africa, South America, and the Middle East will begin aligning their economic and diplomatic interests with America's rivals. In regions where USAID once funded food security programs, Chinese-backed alternatives will emerge. Where USAID once provided post-conflict stabilization funding, Russian-backed mercenary groups will fill the void. Once this realignment happens, it will not be easily reversed. Countries that become dependent on Chinese or Russian support will no longer be open to US influence, fundamentally reshaping global alliances in favor of America's adversaries. While USAID's collapse represents a loss of influence, the Department of Defense, DOD, is facing a direct operational crisis. DOGE has laid off 5,400 civilian personnel, many of them in logistics, intelligence support, and cybersecurity roles, critical functions that enable the US military to sustain its global operations. The consequences of these cuts will not be immediately obvious. Fighter jets will still fly, ships will still patrol the seas, and bases will still operate. But the underlying logistics that make rapid military deployments possible will begin to break down. Within months, the military's global supply chains will slow, equipment deliveries will take longer, repair backlogs will increase, and operational readiness will quietly erode. If a crisis emerges, whether in Taiwan, Ukraine, or the South China Sea, US forces will find themselves stretched thinner than expected, unable to mobilize as quickly or sustain operations as effectively. Meanwhile, cybersecurity vulnerabilities will multiply. The laid-off DoD personnel include experts responsible for defending military networks against cyber attacks. If these roles are not refilled, America's military infrastructure will become an increasingly attractive target for foreign adversaries. The overall effect of these cuts is a military that appears strong on paper, but is internally weakening, making the US more vulnerable to miscalculations and provocations by rival nations who see an opportunity to challenge American power. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, is suffering from a quiet but devastating crisis. DOGE has aggressively pushed buyouts and early retirement offers for intelligence personnel, leading to a mass exodus of experienced field agents and analysts. For now, the full consequences are not yet visible, but that is precisely what makes this failure so dangerous. Intelligence gaps do not manifest as immediate crises. They reveal themselves only when a threat emerges that the US did not see coming. As experienced intelligence officers leave, and their replacements are not trained quickly enough, the CIA's human intelligence networks will shrink. Agents embedded in foreign governments and militant organizations will lose contact, critical sources will dry up, and America's ability to track adversaries will decline. Cyber intelligence operations will suffer as well. With fewer personnel monitoring digital threats, foreign cyber attacks will become harder to detect and counteract. The US may only realize how much intelligence has been lost when a geopolitical crisis erupts and decision-makers find themselves making blind guesses instead of informed responses. The cuts to USAID, DOD and the CIA are not separate failures, they compound and accelerate each other. As USAID retreats, China and Russia will expand their influence, creating long-term diplomatic realignments that weaken America's ability to operate globally. As DOD loses logistical capacity and cyber defenses, the US military will quietly weaken, making it less capable of responding to emerging crises. As the CIA loses intelligence capabilities, the US will become blind to growing threats, reacting too late to prevent conflict or security breaches. Individually, each of these crises would be a major setback. Together, they represent the systematic unraveling of US global power. For decades, the United States has relied on a delicate balance of diplomatic, military and intelligence power to maintain its global standing. That balance is now being destroyed from within. If these cuts are not reversed, America will wake up in late 2025 to find that it is no longer the world's leading power. It will have ceded influence to its rivals, weakened its military deterrence, and lost the ability to detect and respond to threats before they reach US shores. This will not be an immediate collapse, but that is what makes it even more insidious. The damage will accumulate quietly, invisibly, until the moment the US is tested and finds itself unprepared, outmaneuvered, and unable to defend its interests. A crisis is coming. The only question is whether the government will act before it is too late. What began as a bureaucratic restructuring effort has spiraled into a direct threat to the stability of the federal government. The Department of Government Efficiency, framed as a bold modernization initiative, has instead become a reckless and dangerously unaccountable force, gutting essential government functions with little oversight and even less foresight. The cracks are already forming, and if these policies are not stopped, they will widen into a full-scale collapse of critical public services, economic stability and national security. This is not speculation, it is a trajectory. Already we see the early failures of DOGE's initiatives taking root. The IRS is faltering, unable to process tax returns or detect fraud at scale. The GSA's logistical paralysis is preventing agencies from obtaining the basic supplies they need to function. The NSF's funding cuts are setting back research that the government relies on for both economic and technological advancement. Meanwhile, the public health system is eroding, with the CDC struggling to track emerging threats, the NIH losing its ability to fund rapid response medical research, and the USDA falling behind in containing agricultural crises. If these failures persist, they will compound and reinforce each other, triggering a self-perpetuating breakdown across the government. Financial dysfunction will bleed into economic instability, which will weaken public health infrastructure, which will leave the nation vulnerable to crises it will no longer be equipped to handle. And beyond our borders, the consequences will be just as severe. US aid is withdrawing from its critical global humanitarian role, ceding influence to foreign adversaries who are eager to fill the vacuum. The DOD is losing its ability to maintain logistical readiness, leaving the US military increasingly stretched and slow to respond. The CIA's intelligence failures are not yet visible, but they will be when the next geopolitical crisis emerges and the US. DOGE is not just a flawed policy, it is a direct threat to national stability. Yet this collapse is not inevitable, not yet. The courts are beginning to scrutinize DOGE's legality. Internal resistance is growing. The public is waking up to the scale of the disaster that is unfolding. But time is running out. The next few months will determine whether the United States corrects its course or continues down the path towards systemic failure. The warning signs are here. The danger is real. If DOGE's policies are not reversed, the consequences will be irreversible. Government does not collapse overnight, but if left unchecked, it will collapse all the same.